Without further ado, may I introduce the Mayor, Councillor Porteous, to open this evening's function.
Okay. Hello everybody. Welcome to this wonderful event, Saving Ballast Point Forum. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal and the Wongal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay our respects to their elders, both past and present, on whose land we gathered this evening, and to any Aboriginal people that are present here today as well. I'd also like to acknowledge my fellow councillor, Councillor Stamalos, who's here this evening, and also like to acknowledge Tom Rien, who I saw earlier this evening. Hello. Also former councillors Kath Hacking, who are here tonight, and former councillor Trevor Snape, who I noticed here tonight as well. I hope I have acknowledged. And look, most of all, I'd like to acknowledge the activists here tonight, community activists. Of course, we're going to be hearing from Fergus Fricke and Roger Parks and Helen Stiles, and I know a lot of the other activists are here as well this evening, and I'm sure we'll be hearing from you as well during the evening. I'd also like to acknowledge Rosalind Burge because she'll be emceeing and obviously has a lot to do with the organisation of this evening, and our local history librarian Amy Czar as well for the great work she has done this evening in making tonight happen, as well as the other library staff, including Marilyn Taylor, who I can see up there now. Look, the heroes of Ballast Point, I think they go down. They've become folklore for us in Balmain and Birch Grove, and certainly Leichhardt Council as well. The people saved Ballast Point, and I think that is such an important point to say over and over again. It's a defining moment for Leichhardt. It was when this happened, I think we all remember that the state seat was becoming an increasingly marginal seat, and the community were becoming stronger, more united, and ever more strategic in their activism. And the council was becoming more and more engaged in that process, and the good councillors were certainly coming on board. They were listening and they were supporting more and more this important campaign to save Ballast Point. I have to say, I'm in awe of people like Fergus and Roger and June and many, many more of you who have, over many, many years, been such strong community activists for this community. I mean, Ballast Point is obviously been a huge turning point, and we've had other fantastic wins like Helen Park. And of course, there are more fights we still have to win. We still have to win our fight for White Bay, for example. We still have to win against the absurd development proposal that's currently engulfing the former Balmain League site down in Rozelle. I appreciate the hiss. But we have won others, and we have to win them again, like the Stop the M4 East, which again looks like it's going to rear its head during this term of the state government. And we have the light rail, which I think is another fantastic win for this community, which we'll see starting to be built later on this year. Those battles are won by people that never say no, that never give up, that are absurdly optimistic, even though there are thousands of reasons not to be. And they are what a community is about, and they are certainly what this community is about. Ballast Point was open to the public on the 11th of July 2009, and each time we go there, we are thankful and we admire. We are thankful because we have such a beautiful park, and we are thankful to the wonderful work of McCoxell Gregor in the design and in the extraordinary location which we are able to admire, that fantastic view, and to enjoy it in the different ways that we choose to enjoy the park. But most of all, when we go there, I think we admire our community, we admire the many years of long campaigning that has enabled that battle to be won and for Ballast Point to be saved. And we are thankful, very thankful to all of you for that work you have done, the many things you've given up many, many times to save Ballast Point, to save it for all of us forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Porteous. This is the 32nd year of the National Trust's Heritage Festival. It runs formally until the 29th of April, but the exhibition in conjunction with which this evening's presentation is made runs through to the 12th of May, and I would encourage you to go and see it. The theme for this year's Heritage Festival is Amazing Stories, Innovation and Invention. And tonight's presentation celebrates the innovation and action taken by the passionate local resident groups who fought hard to save Ballast Point from the potential development of the Caltex site into residential units. It's a tight agenda and there's not a lot of time for questions and answers along the way, but we'll start with our three presenters and with Fergus Fricke. Four presenters we have, and a film that Jan is going to show us as well. Dr. Fricke grew up in Melbourne, and after working for a few years in Britain and the USA, he accepted a position at Sydney University in 1974 and bought a house in Balmain. He's been involved in a number of community issues and campaigns as a member of the Balmain Association, Friends of Callum Park, and was, of course, an active campaigner for Ballast Point. Currently, he occupies his time above the ground in retirement to persuade Telstra to demolish the Balmain telephone exchange, and below the ground, he's writing a book on the sanitation of Balmain. Please welcome Fergus.
My function in this part is to give you a bit of the background of why there was a group of people, well, a lot of people, who decided to try and get Ballast Point as parkland. There were many factors involved. Yes. Yep. Okay. There were many factors involved, and I can't say that any one particular one was important, but I would like to give some of the background of what Balmain was like in the 70s and even the 80s, which I think gives an indication of why things might have happened the way they did. It's worth having a look at what Balmain was like in the 1950s. And although it's very hard from this slide to see that, there are a couple of things that I would like to point out. You probably recognise this as an aerial photo of Balmain, and in the bottom right-hand side, we have the Longnose Point, or Geraldman Point here, and you can see that much of it is industrial, as is most of the waterfront all around Balmain. The bit that isn't industrial, is clearly not industrial, is Birch Grove Oval. There is another park, and this is fairly important to all this process of Ballast Point. One other park that was important in this that is not shown, and that is Elkington Park. Now, both of those were tips, and that's why they're parks. The Birch Grove Park was there because the coal mine needed somewhere to tip their spoil, and it then became a park. Elkington Park became a park because it was the garbage tip. Balmain is very badly off for open space. In fact, we have one of the lowest open space ratios in the Sydney area, and we have an even lower open space ratio than Sydney City Council, and that becomes a fairly important issue. Just now to look at a little bit more detail at that same photo and concentrate on Mort Bay. This is then a sort of more detail of that previous photograph, and the things I want you to note here are the old Mort Docks work, which closed down in 1957. This was a huge industrial enterprise, and at its peak there were about 1,500 men working at it. You will see that it extended far beyond the area that's normally considered as the Mortstock Works. Here's Mort Bay. There were slipways here. There was a huge fabrication shed here that went from Cameron Street and the Dry Dock Hotel there right up to Curtis Road and many other things. And Ballast Point Road here was up to there was also the dock. It was a huge enterprise, and when that closed, it was the first, I guess, of the industrial sites that closed in Balmain, or pretty much the first, and it was obvious that the reasons why it closed, it could no longer do the work that it was meant to do. Ships got too big, it became too difficult to get materials and people into the site. And this was the same situation with many other industries in Balmain. In particular, you had Unilever, the Monsanto, and other industries such as those, and including Caltex, couldn't expand, and they needed to move out somewhere else. Another issue that I think is important in this story is that Mortstock and other areas were very important centres of Union and Labor Party activism, and I think that has been very important in many issues within Balmain, including the campaign, the Ballast Point campaign. Now, things started to change. When the Mortstock closed, there were proposals that it became a steel fabricating industry, and the community fought that. And I think as consolation, we got the ANL container terminal, and this is the site that has been cleared ready for the Mort Bay container terminal. And you can see that it covers most of the area that the Mortstock covered as well. Of course, the old dry dock was this area here. I'm well aware that many of you have been in Balmain longer than I have, but I thought, okay, I'll write down a few things that immediately sprung to my mind as my memories of coming to Balmain. First of all, it was working class, largely. It was pretty much treeless. I was very pleased to know that the Rabbitoh called every week and not only sold rabbits but sold eggs as well. The Garbos collected garbage from metal garbage cans. I'm sure you all remember those. They were very noisy, and the trucks in which they collected the garbage were open trade trucks. Just a little story. Soon after I arrived and had been woken up at about 5 o'clock on several occasions, there were garbage collections twice weekly at that stage, and I didn't appreciate being woken up at 5 o'clock in those days. Now I'm awake at 5 o'clock every morning, just about. However, for other reasons. The garbage lids were ripped off and thrown down on the ground, and the bins were either handed up or tipped into the trays and thrown on the ground, and it was rather noisy. And so I rang up and asked council whether something could be done about this, and the next garbage day came, and from I think probably 100 metres up the road or so, I heard this yell, "What number was that guy at who complained about the noise?" And there was sort of yelled back 229, which is the number of my house in Roundtree Street. And anyway, the truck eventually arrived at 229, the lid was ripped off, and it was hit against the ground, bang, 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 bang. And I didn't complain anymore at all. There was a horse and cart used to come round sweeping the streets. We don't get sweeping the streets very much, I must say, but these days, but it was very pleasant to get it done by a horse and cart. There wasn't any old Iron Man came around every couple of months, so we didn't need to have the special household collections. He actually paid a little bit of money for certain things. Dogs weren't as, I guess, many dogs as there are now, but there was much more dog shit around at those days. And in fact, somebody produced T-shirts saying Balmain dog shit capital, of, not just of the world, of the universe. Leichhardt Council had a rat catcher, and we used the rat catcher at times. There was a great sense of community. I've just put down a few things there that I was involved in, the theatre group, the music society, and we set up fruit and vegetable co-ops and babysitting clubs because there was no childcare in those days. You had to organise your own. The Rozzle Rizzle, the Balmain Roselle RSL, known as the Rozzle Rizzle, was in a good watering hole, and there were plenty of other watering holes, of course. We had a couple of SP bookies just near us, which you knew because of all the phone calls you heard on Saturdays. Some of the houses round about had dirt floors, which was interesting. That was the first time I'd seen houses with these clay floors, fairly basic housing. A lot of the houses were shared. You could rent a terraced house for $30 a week. Many of the toilets were in the dunnies out the back still. In fact, there was one family I knew who moved into Balmain, and I asked them why they'd chosen the house they did, and they said it was the only house they'd seen with an indoor toilet. So the dunnies were still used, but the dunny pans didn't have to be collected in those days. There was no library, even although back in 1880 there was a library in this building. We didn't have a library in Balmain in the 70s. There were very different shops. There were 7 butcher's shops that I've counted up in Balmain in the early 70s. There were several greengrocers. Strangely, there were no lingerie shops, and I must say I missed out there somewhere. I assume that none of the women in Balmain at that stage wore undies, but I didn't realise that at the time. There were very few cars, lots of trucks, and the trucks were mainly going to and from the ANL terminal. The traffic lights didn't exist at Roundtree Street and Darling Street. There wasn't enough traffic for that. Despite the very few vehicles there were 4 petrol stations, service stations in Balmain. One in East Balmain, the Golden Fleece station. One at the corner of Darling Street and Birchgrove Road, which was the BP station. An Esso station in the middle of this side of the shopping centre, and which was the biggest of them. And of course there was Bill's Garage as well. There were lots of enthusiasts, students, artists, musicians, political activists. Of course there was the Tigers, and they're sort of still around, I suppose. And the ALP was pretty big. It was an important organisation in Balmain in those days. And Izzy Weiner and Nick Oraglass also were important. Excuse me while I zip through these, and I'll give you some idea of what the new look is in Balmain at that time. There were lots of issues, lots of campaigns, and so we cut our teeth on many things before Ballast Point. And just to give you a couple of issues, not ones that I was involved in, but the Balmain Association was formed to try and save the watch house, which was threatened. They did that. They tried to save the other one, which is a very important one, the first house in Balmain, Birch's house in Louisa Road. That's now a beautiful set of apartments, well, an ugly set of apartments, sorry. We had the White Bay coal loader. I think Black Bay would have been a better term for it. It was a huge undertaking. There was lots of black dust. There was no water sprinklers. There was no fence around it or anything. Horrible place. The Balmain Association tried to do something about the coal loader. We eventually got water sprinklers. Clontarf Cottage was also threatened with demolition, and the community saved that and did it up and restored it at the community's expense. There were lots of other industrial sites. Colgate over on the right-hand side there, the power boiler house for them is gone, but other parts of the building are there. And of course, the Sydney Engineering Slipway is long since gone. A&L Terminal was an important one for a number of reasons. Firstly, well, for the main one, and I'll try and be brief on this, was the traffic. This is an example outside my house in Roundtree Street on a Sunday morning, and it happened fairly frequently that the police would come round about 6 or 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning, get your car out of the road. A load is coming down or a load is going out. And this is just an example of one of them. It was a two-way street in that way, not a one-way street, by the way. The gates went up earlier in 1972, I think, to try and stop trucks going at night and during weekends. There were lots of accidents and there were deaths. And I think the death was probably spelt the death knell of A&L Terminal in Balmain, but there was a huge amount of community action to get A&L out. Then we had to worry about what would happen with the space, not just that space, but other industries that were going. And so I think, although this was Bruce Petty's cartoon for Ballast Point, I think it was equally pointed to other places that were being abandoned by industry. So what did residents, why did residents act to save Ballast Point? Well, I think the issues were that there were a lot more middle class people moving in, were idealistic and so on, and we did question authority more than perhaps the older residents in Balmain were doing. We had plenty of practice by the time it came for Ballast Point. There was an issue, which many of you remember, the proposal to put a second harbour crossing. Well, there were the 4 possible scenarios. All 4 came through Balmain and would have wrecked Balmain had they occurred. And so there was a lot of activity there and a lot of anger that I think helped in the campaign for Ballast Point. There was obviously too a desire to retain Balmain's heritage, and we had a number of other factors, and one of them, I think, a very important one, although I will probably embarrass Tom Uren by saying this, I think was Tom Uren. He gave us entree into the inner workings of the Labor government, and also, I think, spoke on our behalf to people within the Labor Party. And I think one of the key moments about the campaign was, and I suspect that Tom Uren had a great hand in this as well, was Bob Carr's 1997 Woolwich speech about the preservation of the foreshore, especially the headlands, for the public. Another issue was, I think, we had independence becoming more important on Leichhardt Council, and what I mentioned before, the very low open space ratio of 1.6 hectares per thousand. Melbourne, by the way, Melbourne City Council has about 17.4 hectares per thousand people, to give you some idea of the change. Just again to reinforce the need for open space that I think pushed the campaign along a lot. Here's a copy of a poster that the campaign put out, just showing the areas that where the industry had moved out and where there was going to be developments, residential developments. And so a far greater population in Balmain was going to ensue with very little more open space. If you want to know a bit more about what Balmain was like, the best recommendation I can give you is to to get a copy of David Little's book on Balmain, published in 1985. I'm sure David can tell you where you might find copies of it, as he's in the front row here. In the library, okay. It's a wonderful set of photographs to give you a much better impression of what Balmain was like at that time than I can give you. And almost finally, you'll be pleased to know, Rosalind, I think Bruce Petty too summed up the situation, the change that had occurred from 1965 up until 2005. We have here the hairy young ones. Sorry, I have to get my... the 1965 hairy young ones coming in, and in 2005 the same couple over here. I did ask him today, would he draw one for 2015, and he said, well, he mightn't be around to do that, but he would try. And you see the sort of area that we came to with the Cornish stores and so on, and now we've got the four-wheel drives and the newer buildings and so on. So I think that sums up the situation fairly well, but I would finally like to leave you with some words about Sydney Harbour that Tim Flannery wrote, which I think are very pertinent to the whole situation. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Helen Stiles, who's going to talk about the early days of the battle and some of the legal battles indeed. Helen, a journalist and barrister and a long-term resident of Birchgrove, was a leading campaigner in the legal battles initiated in 1990 on behalf of the Balmain Association to regain Leichhardt Council's planning powers by opposing the New South Wales Minister for Planning's decision to rezone the 5 industrial sites. As a founder of the Ballast Point Trust in 1990, she campaigned to raise the $10,000 prize for the Balmain Urban Design Competition in conjunction with the National Trust of Australia, most fittingly, since this is an event in that festival today, which was designed to provide a comprehensive plan for the rezoning of the peninsula's 5 industrial sites. Helen was elected to Leichhardt Council as an independent in 1992 and involved in the 4 court cases and the Committee of Inquiry, which succeeded in preserving Ballast Point zoning as an industrial site until finally the government purchased the headland in 2001. Thank you, Helen.
Jack Mundy asked me to pass on his apologies that he could not be here tonight. I want to just talk firstly about my memories from 1974, because coincidentally I moved into Balmain at about the same time. I lived in Newman Street, Birchgrove on Longnose Point for 23 years, from 1974 until 1997. I used to love walking down Louisa Road in those days, past ocean-going ships anchored at the shipyards at Story and Kears and Howard Smith. My husband and I bought a half share in the Federation House belonging to the Masterman family on the tip of Longnose Point as tenants in common with our neighbour Nick Masterman. He ran a sailing school on the point and built wooden clinker sailing boats on the block at the corner of Newman Street and Louisa Road, above the tunnel that ran under our house from Birchgrove to Greenwich. Balmain was a unique, vibrant community with filmmakers, journalists, artists, writers, musicians and actors, and young professionals living in and renovating the terrace houses and old mansions that all shared views over a working harbour when the containers were still moored in Snails Bay and the ferry terminal was at Moort Bay. Then the first change came in the early 80s when we became involved in the bridge campaign. My husband, Bruce Allen, who was a TV producer, chaired the combined bridge action group, which consisted of Balmain and Greenwich residents opposing the New South Wales government proposals for a second harbour crossing from Balmain to Greenwich or Wollstonecraft. 3 of the Department of Main Roads bridge proposals involved freeways through the white picket fence Birchgrove Oval hallowed site of the first rugby union match in Sydney. The Birchgrove residents produced highly publicised entertaining fundraising events to oppose the bridge plans, including $100 a plate dinners, picnics with boats ferrying passengers between speakers at Longnose Point, where we had Tom Uren, Minister in the Whitlam government, and Greenwich, where we had John Howard from the opposition, and a fantastic evening concert was held at Birchgrove Oval with the Sydney Chamber Orchestra accompanying the principal cellist Nathan Wax, and a one-act play by David Williamson called The Bridge was performed by the actor John Gayden. The harbour crossing proposals for Balmain were shelved just before Christmas in 1981, and the basket weavers of Balmain, as Paul Keating described the residents of Sydney's oldest suburb, celebrated their effective campaign in the cafes and pubs that dotted the industrial landscape. In fact, the DMR officials asked us if we couldn't organise a celebratory event as a result of winning the campaign, simply because they'd so enjoyed attending all the functions that we held. The terrace houses continued to be restored and the trees planted in all the open courtyards, and as gentrification proceeded in the peninsula, the property prices rose until we faced a serious new threat when urban consolidation threatened our idyllic existence as a community. Local environment plans for the rezoning of the 5 waterfront industrial sites were being prepared by Leichhardt Council, and the residents were once again galvanised into action against the plans for medium-density housing, generating overpopulation, crowding and traffic problems, and the consequent loss of amenity and views in the narrow, hilly streets of Balmain. The librarian, Amy Czar, has provided a timeline for the Ballast Point campaign, and Fergus has unfolded the earlier history from the 50s, including the early groups, the Snails Bay Group, which was established to campaign for the residential development on the Caltex site, and then the United Residents Task Force burst against the overdevelopment of the 5 waterfront industrial sites, and Kath Hacking was one of the very active members of Burst. I'd like to provide a snapshot of my personal recollections of the fundraising campaign for a comprehensive town plan for the peninsula and the publicity that was generated by the Balmain Association's legal action to return the planning powers to Leichhardt Council. The reason it was extraordinary is that the residents took the action and the council refused to support them. And that was a pretty unique situation. In August 1990, the New South Wales Minister of Planning, David Hayes, stripped Leichhardt Council of its planning powers, and he appointed a planning administrator, Sean O'Toole, to take over the planning powers from the council, claiming Leichhardt Council had delayed its rezoning consideration of the 5 foreshore sites beyond what was reasonable. The council had failed to meet Minister Hayes' 5-week deadline for the preparation of 5 local environment plans for the contentious industrial sites, the Ampol Unilever, the former Monsanto chemical factory, the Chemplex Packer site, Caltex and Balmain Power Station, which made up 23 hectares of foreshore land. So on Guy Fawkes Night, the 5th of November 1990, the Balmain Development Trust organised a $100 a plate dinner at the Wentworth Hotel to oppose the takeover of the council powers and to announce a competition in conjunction with the National Trust for an urban design prize for a comprehensive plan for the Balmain development of the Balmain Peninsula. The dinner was reported in film coverage on the ABC as Democracy in Action, when the playwright David Williamson, who lived in Louisa Road, was interviewed at the dinner and asked what would happen if the planning minister did not agree to a comprehensive plan for the waterfront sites in Balmain, he quoted Henry Lawson, "There will be blood on the wattle," hence the T-shirts that we used throughout our campaign. On 14th of December 1990, the Balmain Association, and Jane Ward was the president at the time, and Kath Hamey was an active supporter of this action. They commenced the first court case in the Land and Environment Court on behalf of the residents to have the appointment of the administrator for Leichhardt Council by the New South Wales Planning Minister David Hay declared invalid because it was a manifestly unreasonable exercise of the minister's power. When Susan Ferrier, who was our solicitor from the firm of Michael Mobbs, and the senior counsel Gary Downs, QC, and I arrived at the court for the directions hearing that day, the bar table was crammed with QCs and solicitors for the 4 respondents, and the court was overflowing with representatives of the developers. In setting down the dates for the hearing, Justice Cripps mentioned the ABC News report on the Balmain Urban Design Prize competition and noted sardonically that the Balmain residents had decided to make their own plan for the development of the waterfront industrial sites on the peninsula. It was a very exciting, cliff-hanging Christmas and New Year for the members of the Balmain Development Trust and the Balmain Association, as we continued to fundraise with raffles and Lamington sales. Could we pay the court costs, and what would happen to the members of the Ballast Point Development Trust and the Balmain Association as the applicant if we lost the case? Leichhardt Council was joined to the action but refused to support the residents or the respondents and asked the court for costs against the residents. When I telephoned the Mayor of Leichhardt Council, Bill Brady, in January 91 before the hearing and asked for the council's support, he told me, "You can't win against a Minister of the Crown and 4 multinationals." The owners seeking development of the 5 sites were the New South Wales Government, which owned the Balmain Power Station, the Chemplex Australia, for the Monsanto site owned by Kerry Packer, and Caltex, Unilever and Ampol. We lost the application in the Land and Environment Court when it was dismissed by Justice Cripps on 23rd of January 1991, and we went straight to the New South Wales Court of Appeal. President of the New South Wales Court of Appeal, Justice Michael Kirby, was the duty judge that day, to the surprise of everyone. The appeal was heard by Justice Kirby and Justices Priestley and Handley, and the decision that the appointment of the planning administrator was invalid was handed down by the court on Tuesday, the 19th of February 1991. The court ordered the minister to pay the costs of both cases for the Balmain Association, the 350-member residents group which took the government to court over the minister's actions, to our great relief. I want to quote the rest of the story from Stephen Long's feature article that was published in the Eastern Herald, in the Sydney Morning Herald at that time. He reported, Leichhardt Wednesday, war broke out here last night at exactly 7:05. In the town hall, warring armies took to each other, screaming blue murder and baying for blood. And the cartoon shows chairing a meeting at Leichhardt Council with people using chairs to attack one another. Hostilities began after the Mayor, Labor Alderman Bill Brady, used his casting vote to block debate on a motion calling for him to resign as a betrayer of the people over his role in the battle for Balmain. Above the din of the battle, it was impossible to catch more than snatches of action as the shots were fired. Communist independence, Alderman Doug Spedding bellowed at the Mayor's rivals. "Take your Nazi jackboots and stick them up your ass," replied Larry Hand, the community independence leader. Earlier that day, the Court of Appeal had ruled that the appointment of the administrator was invalid, and that his order to rezone the 5 waterfront sites had been manifestly unreasonable because of the limited time that was given to the council. It was an embarrassing defeat for the mayor, who'd acquiesced in the appointment of the administrator and refused to back residents in their court action against the minister. Mr. Brady remained intransigent that night, twice refusing his casting vote to defeat motions calling for him to resign and blocking a symbolic $500 donation towards a planning competition organised by the residents group, the Balmain Development Trust. Across the municipality, in a home on Longnose Point, Birch Grove, residents celebrated their victory, and the front page of the Telegraph showed the residents at the Ampol Unilever site celebrating the win, and on the Longnose Point site, the residents of Birch Grove celebrating the Caltex win. The article quotes Susan Frizzoli, who says, "Shall we reveal ourselves as a public servant, a nurse, a chef and a mum?" Talking about the Balmain Development Trust. We beat them all, we beat the state. The playwright David Williamson was there, and also Balmain MP Dawn Fraser. Her one-time support for the minister's action forgiven now that she joined the residents' side. Miss Fraser drank the obligatory champagne toast and then, with obvious relief, switched back to beer. The council elections in 1992 returned 7 independent councillors to the 12-member Leichhardt Council. The new South Wales Minister Robert Webster held a public committee of inquiry, which had been called for by the petitions when the planning for the sites was first announced. He finally held that into the rezoning, and then he went ahead and rezoned the sites again in 1993. Leichhardt Council's application against rezoning was dismissed in 1994, but again, they succeeded in the Court of Appeal. The important thing was that once that site had been rezoned, it would have been out of reach of public money, because eventually, when the Carr Labor government purchased the site, they purchased it for $24 million. They'd been talking about figures like $84 million. All kinds of figures were being pulled out of the sky at the thought of a residential rezoning. Now, Roger Parks, I'm finishing up right now. Roger Parks, who was chairman of the Ballast Point campaign committee, he took over from Susan Frizzoli, and he steered the program right through until the residents' dream for a Sydney Harbour Park on the Caltex site at Ballast Point became a reality. So, Roger, over to you.
Roger was the chair of the Ballast Point campaign committee from 1992 until it was disbanded in 2011. Prior to that, he acted with fellow campaigners Helen Stiles, who we've just heard, Susan Frizzoli, Roddy Kennard, Millie O'Loughlin and Jim McMahon. Repeatedly, one aspect stood out in the campaign, and that was the community's refusal to accept that Ballast Point would not be public open space. Roger has lived in the Leichhardt municipality since 1968, and he's been a community activist for most of the time. I don't know how he fitted in work, having been president and treasurer of the Balmain High School P&C, an active participant with the Balmain Association, and he thoroughly enjoys his morning walks in Ballast Point.
Thanks very much. It was always my sad position in society to follow on from people like Helen Stiles. Her little, what she just outlined then was one of the most fantastic campaigns, I think, that people have ever put together. And Frizzoli and Stiles and Millie O'Loughlin and Robbie Kennard, who isn't here, they did a fantastic job. Anyway, having gone through all these court cases and, told the minister that he can get stuffed, they said to me, "Roger, would you mind taking over the chairmanship of this this body. And I thought, well, what am I going to do now? See, the crowd had gone, all the excitement had gone, we'd won a few cases and things. And it basically came down to the fact that what we wanted was open space. We wanted this Ballast Point as open space, and we had to work out a way of getting things organised along those lines. We knew that we had to keep the council on side. That was one of the most important things, because they basically determined how land would be zoned. And Ballast Point was designated industrial waterfront or something like that. And while that remained, residential development could not be instigated. And from 1992, as Helen was just said, we were able to get 100% support in the council for the site remaining industrial waterfront until it was designated open space. Now, without the support of the council, it would have been very, very difficult. And from the very outset, they said we could rent this hall free of charge. They did all the mailing, because in those days we didn't have emails. Now you can contact 500 people in 2.5 seconds. In those days we had to write letters and post them and that sort of stuff. There was insurance. We had to get if we had sort of activities, we had to make sure that we had proper insurance, and we were able to do that underneath the cover of the Leichhardt Council. Because what happened was we formed the Balmain Campaign Committee, the Ballast Point Campaign Committee, and that became an official committee of the Leichhardt Council, and therefore we had all the coverage. They ran our bank accounts for us. They did a whole range of things. They provided typing facilities and a whole range of things. And we on to the next one yet? Is it the next one? No. And so that was really how we were able to continue. What we also had to do was not only keep the council on side, but then we had to make sure that the community was committed to having Ballast Point as a open space. And to do that, we thought, well, we've got to maintain an awareness, and you can only have so many sausage sizzles. I've had a lot of sausage sizzles. And we thought, well, we've got to make it a bit more exciting, and that was really where Helen was really fantastic. And one day she said to me, well, we'll just hire Taronga Park Zoo. And I thought, what a great idea. And she said, we'll have a dinner out there, and we'll charge $103 per plate. Now, this is back in, I don't know when it was, but a long time ago. And $103 is the equivalent of about $250 now, And I said to Helen, nobody will turn up. And she said, oh, yes, they will. And so I think we had about 120 seats, and we couldn't knock them back with a stick. There were people lining up to spend all this money. We put on a ferry, we took people around the harbour, and they kept on giving us money. It was wonderful. So we did that a few times. And then what did we do then? We had, I think one of the most important things we did, we realised that there were a lot of influential people living in the area, and they were really good, and they gave us a lot of their time, a lot of their advice. And Tom Uren's here today. He was right out in front. We've mentioned David Williamson. Jean Linane was fantastic. Bruce Petty, Jack Mundy. And then one day I was sitting at home and the phone went, and it was PJ Keating. And I said, oh yes, thanks for calling. He said, PJ, I can't believe it. And he said he'd like to see the Ballast Point Campaign Committee and Margaret Throsby and the Mayor in his office, and in we went, and he said that he would back us in this campaign for open space, and we were able to get his support along with Jamie Parker's, the Izzy Winers and people like that. We also were able to get Tanya Plibersek, who was very helpful, and it helped us, I think, with the internal workings of the ALP. One thing we did realise too was that there are a lot of skilled people in Balmain, and who could help us put together promotional pieces. Steve Gray had his own advertising agency and helped us putting all the promotional pieces together, and was really very helpful. the other associations who were outstandingly helpful to us, and we to them, I suppose, was the Balmain Association. We had the Mossman Headland Group, and Phil Jenkins, who is here tonight too, and was always giving us help and advice. Then, the third thing we had to do is make sure we kept the politicians on side. Now, here we have a good bunch. On the left, we've got Izzy, myself, Moira Sheehan, Fergus, Bruce Petty, Tanya Plibershek, Sandra Norrie, Tom Uren, and Phil Jenkin. And by keeping these people fully informed of what we were doing, they were able to help us, and we were able to push the campaign of getting the council to keep the open space classification. Finally, the hard thing was keeping the developers out, and this is where we spent a lot of our time. When we first started, Sid Londish had a plan for building 248 units on the site, and that would have been sort of Hong Kong, if you like, or New York in Sydney Harbour. Fortunately, he went away. Caltex had a property manager who realised that this was the beginning of his future career, and decided he would develop it. And we used to go in and talk to the Caltex board, and sometimes they'd get really nasty, and other times they'd be quite nice. Well, one of the nasty times, we had the mayor and a few people along, and they said they were going to beat us up or something, And I said, well, that's interesting. I'm going to fly over to America to see your head office, and I know you're very philanthropic as an organisation over there. Maybe we can get things to happen out here as well. Well, the mood in the room changed, and from that moment on, we started to get better response from Caltex than we had in the past. We then came across Walker, the Walker Corporation. They wanted to take it over, and they paid the $350,000. I think it was $350,000 for the option, and they then decided that they would develop it as an industrial site, as it was zoned industrial, and they got a bloke from Argentina, who some of the girls thought was pretty scrumptious, the bloke called De La Vega. And they must have paid him a lot of money, but what he wanted to do was to put up a plan that would have it industrial and would be just horrible, and hope that we would buckle at the knees. Well, we didn't. And I think when I thought we were really getting quite successful in our campaign was when Macquarie Bank sent 7 people around to see us on several occasions. Well, those blokes charged their time out at around about $1,500 an hour, and they'd sit there for hours talking to Helen and myself, and trying to get the land as open space and getting us to back the rezoning with the council. Anyway, that's more or less there are lots of others, because any developer worth his could see that he could make zillions of money out of this, but what we had to do was to delay these people long enough so that we could get other things done. And we really, as a group, we didn't really know how long we could keep this delaying tactic up, and we didn't quite know how we were going to win. And then one day, Bob Carr got on a ferry and came over and said he's going to buy it for $24 million. And that, was a lot of people, a lot of action from a lot of people. And I think that it was just fantastic that we were able to get this site. And I must admit it was a bit of a surprise, but there it is. And I'm glad to be able to go walking there every morning, so it's very nice. Anyway, that briefly is how we organised a fair bit of this, and that sort of sums up that side of it. Thanks.
Roger, thank you. Can you hear me at the back? Yes. So, thank you very much, all 3 speakers. I should remind you that Leichhardt Council is undertaking an oral history project interviewing these people and others on this subject, and Leichhardt Council is really energising its oral history collection with the work of Amy and Marilyn. But so you can hear their words directly at any time if you go and listen to the CDs in the library. But in the meantime, do you have any questions for our speakers? Gosh, enthusiastic hand at the back.
But my real question is, should we ever settle the legal dispute with Walker? And what did he walk away with? So little contribution to the site.
In 2002, when Bob Carr announced that the state government would take over the site, an offer was made to Caltex and to Walker, two separate offers. Caltex were offered, I think, $14.375 million, and that included not only the cost of the site, but demolition of all the buildings and facilities on the site and remediation of the site. Walker was offered $10.1 million in lieu of his loss of a fortune. He didn't accept it, and there were many court cases that lasted over 7 years after that, where he tried to get, I think, about $60 million he was after. And the case finally went to the High Court, and that decision was brought down on Christmas Eve 2009, and he was awarded $17,055,138.50.
I just wanted to add something. I've been listening to this, and we recently saw Rats in the Race. This was great. I want to remind people, in fact, part of the strategy throughout this was, of course, to always get council to vote down the change from industrial waterfront on that site, which was crucial. And those of you who know all about Rats in the Race, the wonderful documentary, probably don't know that, in fact, the story behind all that was about this fight for this area. Larry Hand, Trevor Slade, Kath Acton were here. We're all very crucial to having the council stay on side. I think that side of the story seems certainly got lost in Rats and Rats. So it's crucial to this whole story.
The council before the 91, which was the 87 and 91 council. Oh, you're not working? No, recorded. Oh, being recorded, gee. Refused to back the residents, and that's very true, but it wasn't for want of trying. That particular council from 87 to 91 was the last brutal council of Leichhardt Council politically. Every council since then has been relatively civilised. But it was a very brutal council. In fact, the council was split 6-all on that issue, and the last mayor of that council was Bill Brady, and I'd been on the council for 8 years, and I ran for mayor the first time and lost out of a hat. And every major decision of that council, particularly to do with the 5 sites, was a split decision, and Bill Brady used his casting vote for the forces of evil and not the forces of good. And interestingly enough, the very last meeting of that council, Bill Brady brought a mayoral minute down to rezone the Caltex site for residential. And the only power we had, that is the good 6 as it were, was Nick and Izzy, myself, Kate Butler, Betty Leone, Sue Stock, and I think it might have been Bob Heffernan, although my memory's failing. The only power we had to stop it was to walk out of the meeting, which we did, and denied a quorum. And there was a lot of arm twisting to get us to come back in, but we didn't go back in. So if we actually hadn't have walked out, the 6 of us, it would have been rezoned, but luckily we had that power, not to create something, but to stop something. And of course, the next council that came in, when Helen and Trevor and Kath came in 91, the numbers had changed dramatically, and we were able to put a resolution forward. I put a mayoral minute, not to rezone the Caltex site, to rezone the others, because they were close to Victoria Road, etc. I won't go into the reasons for, but we were resolute not to do Ballast Point, and I think that was carried 12-0. Was that right? I think it was. Yeah, and it was a good example of the council working with the residents, and I think that was good. And of course, events moved on, and we were lucky it worked out the way it did. Thank you.
I would like to apologise to all of those people that we bullied into paying $100 a head for a dinner. I felt guilty about that many times, but we won, and that was the important thing. Thank you.
Millie, Roddy, Helen and Susan, I can remember that photograph that was in the Herald, which was a cook, a nurse and a lawyer or something who did all this campaigning. You guys need to stand up and have your photo taken tonight, please. No, but you forward, fantastic. Millie, as you said, bullying people into paying $100 for a dinner that only cost $20 and we were making all that money. No, I think you were great.
I mean, there were years of, trespass and I remember being chased through the Caltex site by security people who caught me at the point that when the park was open, when I went there, that was the point where I saw the Harbour Bridge, and I knew that the people had to get that view. But in this context, I'd like to thank Val Hamey. Kath is a wonderful, wonderful person at history, but Val Hamey was treasurer of the Balmain Association, and we worked very closely together on the monthly newsletters. He'd ring me up and say, "It's that time of the month again, Jane." Oh no! So, but he had the foresight to get the Balmain Association incorporated, and that's what enabled us to take action on behalf of all the community groups and auspice the action. So I really would like to thank my favourite old man, Val Hamey, if he's here or not, my grumpy old man.
Our final speaker this evening is Christian. Christian Borchet is an Associate Director of McGregor Coxall Design. He's a German-educated architect with professional experience in a wide range of urban design and planning. Christian's experience include large-scale urban master planning and the design of urban and landscape projects, and tonight he's here to tell us about the design of Ballast Point Park. I think you need this. Note to council, new equipment.
New for me as well. And speaking right into it, is that right? Thank you very much for having us tonight, and thank you very much for finally have the chance of saying thank you to all these guys who worked for us to have the opportunity to work on a site like this. This is a once-in-a-life chance for us to have been lucky enough to design Ballast Point Park and to hopefully create a park that you, after all your years of effort and hard work, appreciate and enjoy. What I will do tonight is, I guess, wrapping up this exciting story of this park by, I guess, reintroducing a little bit where the site is coming from, the history of the site, and the clues that we as designers found on the site, working with the elements that we found on site to create that park that you hopefully enjoy. So I guess 3 steps I want to go through. The history of the site, the origin of the site, then the European influences, and what sort of clues we took out of all those stories. So that site undertook a quite exciting journey that actually didn't last that long, only a few hundred years, 200 years. It started probably as this. This is a photo of the opposite head, Boyle's Head. It started as a lush green vegetated headland with the original population very likely picnicking on the sandstone embankments and fishing and collecting oysters. The story, I guess this section lasted for many tens of thousand years, but it would come to a quick end when a new breed of people would arrive in the harbor and taking possession of the land and starting the interesting transformation of this site, of this headland, by firstly simply cutting off bits and pieces of it, nibbling away the sandstone that they used as a ballast for their vessels to go back to England and other countries in Europe to stabilize those boats. So this was the first process of the quite astonishing transformation of this headland. It became part of the grant to William Balmain. In 1852, Thomas Perkins purchased that land, which we see just up there on the left corner. You all know where it is. And Perkins built in the 60s, early 60s, his land villa, the Menevia, which didn't last long as a family institution, but it became a boarding house soon after. I might go through this because you all probably are very familiar with these kind of historical photos of the site. In the 20s, 1928, Caltex finally purchased the site, demolished the Menevia, and undertook the probably the strongest influence onto that headland by further cutting off pieces of the sandstone, filling up other areas to be able to generate a flat site, terrace platforms, to put the oil tanks and the lubricant manufacture on site. So this is how Ballast Point looked until 2002. You all will be more than familiar with these kind of sites. I might jump this now because obviously you have all more knowledge on what happened with regards to the headland conservation. So we skip this. Maybe there is somebody in here on the photo still. In 2002, as you all know, the government purchased the site and started the process for us as designers to come on board, preparing with community consultations and master plans, a master plan by the designers Anton James and Cap Consulting, that we then in 2006 were lucky enough to win the tender for the further design, development and construction documentation. So this is us, a bunch of Manly-based designers. We did have a little bit of experience with sites of similar nature. Just across the harbour on the northern headland is the former BP site that we were lucky enough to work on a few years before. Similar intense cuttings into the sandstone to make place for those large tanks, a similar topography, a similar heritage of industrial forms and materials that we wanted to reuse. We wanted to work with the industrial heritage as much as then in Ballast Point, the other stories and other histories that took place on the site. Here in BP, it is more the roughness of the industrial, aesthetics that we focused on. But also we explored over there already the idea of sustainable design and the idea of transversing these industrial sites back into natural habitats that would allow for a local fauna to thrive as well. I'm coming already to my last section. How do we respond as designers to an interesting site like this? What clues can we find? How do we come up with our concepts to design parks and headlands of such an importance? And I must say, I guess, as a designer based in Manly, we all probably enjoy our lunch breaks out in the sea far too much. To make us too much, say, headaches about the design and concepts, the best idea or the best way I always found in design is looking at what's there already, trying to understand the site, trying to understand the history of the site, finding clues in the history, finding clues in the site itself, rather than coming up with a completely new and strange concept and just putting on just another level of importance. So when we came onto site in 2006, we found something like this: heaps of rubble. The bunt wall was still there, but the demolition process of the Caltex facilities were underway, and we saw all these broken down concrete, we saw all these broken down steel works, and we thought, well, this is really the rubble, this is really the ballast that we should build the site with, that we should rebuild the park with, rather than repeating the story that has happened to Ballast Point, to the headland before, by cutting virgin landscapes as a quarry and as a resource for our building material here. So we were, in an instance, we were falling in love with all this rubble on site, and we wanted to keep as much as we could and rebuild the site with its own rubble, basically, rebuild the park with its own rubble. We found these steel staircases heavily beautiful, very lean, very elegant structures, absolutely functional, and we thought, okay, there's a inspiration for all our steelworks, so that we do not design something completely new and strange to the site, but rather use the aesthetics that we found on site, and that the site has got so much to offer, such as the Tank 101, which was to be demolished, and we could salvage 8 of those massive steel panels and those rivets to then rebuild the remnants of this tank as the current Tank 101 or the loop ring. So we went back into the office and we said, okay, what we try and do is design this park in the most sustainable way for us possible. We want to reuse as much as possible that we found on site. We want to, when we plant trees, we want to use the trees and the seeds that were actually growing in adjacent sites. So we collected provenance stock quite early and had the nurseries to grow those trees from seeds found in adjacent sites. All the soil that we imported is actually not really soil. It is composted waste material. It's pellets and compost. The loop ring down at the bottom, I'll come to that symbol later, but we really wanted to use as much material as we could to continue the story of the industrial heritage. So the site has got all these different steps and milestones. It started as the source for ballast. An important aspect of the site that the artist Robin Becken, I believe, captured in a really beautiful artwork. A concrete, I guess everybody, if you have been in there, a concrete cylinder into which you walk half over the edge of the shoreline, over the water, and kind of losing your balance, kind of understanding the wobbliness and the shiftiness of a vessel on its way between Europe and Australia. The Menevia is one of the major milestones of the Ballast Point site, which we partly excavated. We knew it was there and there were foundations, but this corner, for example, we discovered when we further undertook remediation works or excavation works for site preparation. The master plan suggested a massive shade structure and other building components to highlight this important footprint of the beautiful sandstone villa. We thought the archaeological and the foundations themselves, the sandstone itself, is strong enough to just be there by itself. So we just surrounded the sandstone foundations with this black enamel wall and inserted the objects that we found while excavating the site. So the Caltex era of the site is probably one of the most intense and strongest, with the most impact onto the site, gave us clues such as the forms and the topography, basically, with all those heavily cut sandstone walls and these terraces that completely not resembled the natural headland as it was before. So we took that as an offer. We said, okay, this headland, we will never be able to regenerate this as a natural form. We didn't want to. We wanted to work with the heavy manipulations of the topography, and we further enhanced it by introducing these walls, which may look from far almost as a sandstone wall. It has got the same rich texture and the same color. But when you go closer, you actually see that it is made of rubble, which we really enjoyed the idea of a material. We didn't really know how this material would work out in detail, but we were intrigued by the idea that this waste material that we all really never appreciated may look from far almost like sandstone itself. But then as you come closer, it starts to look actually really like the rubbish that we would not appreciate. But when you then go closer, on the next level of experience of this wall, you see all these beautiful little artifacts that are embedded in the waste, all tiles. There's all bricks from buildings that we all love to live in. There is artifacts of people's lives, such as the workers that actually built these walls. We asked them to put bits and pieces of their life into these walls. And as you walk around, you may spend hours or even days walking through these walls and trying to discover all the little stories that are embedded in this. And I really love to watch kids doing exactly that, walking along the walls and reading these walls as a book of history almost. These are some of our graphics that we produce to understand the walls and the structure behind, to retain the site and its terraces. Tank 101 is an interesting structure. I guess you all know about this. It's been the last and one of the largest tanks being built with handmade rivets. We found that inspiring, and we loved this structure, and we wanted to keep a memory of this structure on site. So we took a few of these panels, and we're lucky enough to have Les Murray writing a poem that we would engrave into the salvaged steel panels that reshape the tank. And we also added, kind of as a symbol of this transition of fossil fuel needing societies towards a renewable energy society, we added these 8 vertical wind turbines in the hope to generate the energy that we need to use for park lighting. They do work sometimes. I've seen them spinning, like on this photo. I guess they do not spin really like as we imagine them. Here's the Les Murray poem, a beautiful poem that took me a while to understand, but once you have got it, I guess it is really exactly what describes this site. He has written it specifically for this site. I might go back. Those dots, you may see the connection between those dots and the reason for these dots right next to them with the hand-driven rivets. The dots resemble those rivets, and we used that idea for all the signage and for all the text that we established on site. I'm almost there, I think. So yes, the entry gate, I don't have to talk about that. The orange strips that form the shade structures are actually recycled. Well, not recycled, they are wasted seat belts that haven't passed the safety measures in the fabrics. We loved this idea, and we loved the fact that these seat belts flap in the wind and sound almost like kites that the kids in the Menevia boarding house might have flown in up there. I mentioned already the beauty of the structures, which we were absolutely not able to repeat. These lean, elegant structures, Australian standards nowadays would not allow us to build something elegant like this. But we used them as an inspiration, and we used the adjacent harbour bridge and its finish as a paint material for the Ballast Point. And we almost tried to keep the locations of these access stairs as we found them. Another component, obviously Caltex driven, are these massive rings that are almost on the same footprint as those massive tanks that were located there before. And we try to convert those massive tanks and the geometry or the topography that they created with these circular sandstone cuts to generate basically the opposite. We planted paper bark surrounding these tanks, which ideally, or well, which hopefully will at one day enclose these tanks and create a green wall resembling the original steel shape, and you would be able to jump between those massive tanks on those little circular islands and experience those massive tanks as a fairly quiet and introverted space, almost as being within these tanks, but now being converted into a landscape and natural form. That's them. We really love the fact that though this is probably not the safest path of travel, but we love the fact that kids jump over and use these circular rings as a way of exploring their environment and enjoying the journey through the environment, such as this guy. Stormwater management is something that we always focus on a lot. We tried to, well not we tried to, but we captured all the stormwater runoff off-site in wetlands, filtered it through vegetation and sand bed in order to release the stormwater off-site into the harbour, cleansed and absolutely free of pollutants. I might skip a few of these. This is one of my favorite details, as it shows us how we actually, as humans, work with the history that we find, work with the previous layers of use of site, of a function of a site, by these Caltex concrete rings that simply are poured over the beautiful sandstone foundation of the Menevia. And in this detail, I guess, it reveals a lot of what we have done wrong, but also what we as designers for this Ballast Point Park try to use actually and reuse all these different layers of history and these different stories that overwent the site and formed and shaped the site, just to use them and just to reveal them and layer them up and work with them, insert our new works as gentle and simple as possible to let all these old brick walls, all these old sandstone foundations and tanks speak by themselves. what I really enjoyed was when I saw these locks coming up on the walls, demonstrating together with all the people having picnics there and weddings and celebrations, how the people take over possession of this site and actually use it and taking possession in a way as the original people may have as well, enjoying the site as a public domain, having their picnic, enjoying, and this is how we believe that the site might actually finally, after its long journey of being a private, say, land villa place, an industrial site, a boarding place, becoming turning back to where it started as a beautiful green headland in use by the public. Thanks.
Christian, thank you so much. Your photographs were beautiful, and I felt like a criminal ringing my bell again. But you've all been very still and clearly interested in this evening's proceedings, so thank you all very much. But would you all join me in thanking our speakers, Fergus, Helen Stiles, Roger Parks, Jan Wood for her wonderful film, and Christian, so please join me in thanking them all. The other people who it's imperative to thank are the library staff. Amy has organised this evening and curated the exhibition. And she did that in cahoots with her colleagues, of course, Marilyn Taylor, Kathleen Arundel and Melinda Harmer.